What's up guys, welcome back to my channel. Today's video is going to be part 2 of my 2-part series on photography and activism. This video is a long time coming. I think it was about a month ago that I started working on this video. I wrote up a draft script. I started reaching out to people who I wanted to interview to be part of the video. And pretty quickly I realized that it was going to need to be divided into 2 parts. I didn't want to do one big long 45-minute video. Well, joke's on me and on you, because the first part was 45 minutes. And the second part, honestly, looking at the script, is probably going to be pretty close to 45 minutes as well. So I hope this is a topic that interests you. I know that I obviously have a lot to say about it. It's a topic that is extremely interesting to me, and I think there's a lot that must be said about it, especially given the current socio-political climate we're in. There's a lot of good reasons to be attending protests and demonstrations, and there's a lot of really good work that activists as photographers can do to help propel these movements and bring attention to these movements. So, you know, it's not only a timely thing to be talking about, but it's also extremely important. Which is why I am spending so much time on it. I think overall this video series is probably going to take me over 10 hours. So yeah, if you like it, you can give me a like, you can like the video, you can leave a comment down in the description, let me know if I missed anything, if there's anything you want to add, and yeah, if you like the video, just do like it, because it does help me out. Thanks very much, guys. So just like a few quick disclaimers before I get into my overview. I've got my script and my notes and information just down below, so if you see me looking down and reading, that is because this video is scripted. It's not like tightly scripted, but it's loosely scripted, so I'm going to be pulling some information from there. I've also got sources and references listed down below in the description of this video. And I would encourage you to go and check them out. There's some good videos down there that talk about similar things, but not in quite such a long format. So if you just want like the abridged version, you can go and check those out. And then the second disclaimer is, last week we talked to Jason Little, and he made a really good point. He said, you know, I'm not neutral in this, and I don't pretend to be neutral in this. I have a side. And I'm going to make the same point. Like, I have a side in this. I'm part of quite a few different activist movements. It's one of the reasons why I feel like I'm able to speak on this topic, is because I have participated in activist movements. I have photographed many demonstrations in the past, but also, you know, this isn't a politically neutral video. And you'll probably find that out if you keep watching. But I'm going to be talking from a perspective that is very favorable to the activist movements that I'm discussing. I am an environmentalist. I do participate in the anti-racism movement. Like, I do have a side, and it's going to be obvious in this video where my allegiances lie. So if you're a right-winger, maybe not the video for you. So without further ado, let's jump into the overview of this video. So this video is broken up into 5 sections. The first section is an introduction to activism and photography, how to get started, why we do it, etc. The next section is on preparation, so how to come prepared emotionally, physically, and mentally. And then I will talk about how to photograph the movement, this is the third section, respectfully and without damaging the overall message of the demonstration. I'll explain more about what I mean by that later on. Then I will talk about composition and how to still get a good photo despite all of the chaos that is obviously going to be going on. And finally, I'm going to share some cautions and dangers and just things to be mindful of that may be potentially jeopardizing your safety or the safety of others in the movement. I will also put little time cards in the description of the video to let you know if you're not interested in one of these sections, so you can just skip ahead. And yeah, all the sources and things are going to be in the description as well. So without further ado, let's get started. Here's section 1. The first thing to understand is that protest and demonstration photography is unlike any other genre of photography. It's really hard to practice for it or like feel prepared mentally to do it without actually going and doing it. The reason why I say that, you know, it's similar, I suppose, to like a combination between sports photography and street photography, where you're photographing, you know, fast-moving subjects that are ever-changing. You know, a crowd is constantly moving, constantly fluxing, things are happening all around you at all times. And street photography, in that you're taking pictures of strangers, but you're trying to do it in a respectful, artful way that tells a story. You know, I almost want to say that the less you are connected to the movement emotionally or as a participant, as an activist, the more protest photography would be like street photography, because street photography is about, you know, telling a story, finding strangers, surveying what's happening around you, and deciding how you want to compose the images. And those are all elements that go into protest and demonstration photography, for sure they are. But when you are there as an activist, there is another layer that you have to consider, and that is your impact on the movement. So how you frame it, what emotion you show, whose views you're blocking as a photographer, how your presence in the scene impacts the way it looks, and we will talk about that later on. You're not just trying to get the best shot, but you're there in a way that doesn't interfere with the movement, but in fact advances the goals of the movement and honors the movement and its participants to the best of your ability as an artist. You're not just in the photographer's mindset, you're also in the activist mindset. And you're photographing signs, and maybe you're also carrying a sign, or you're photographing hands exchanging pins and pamphlets, and maybe you yourself are accepting or distributing pins and pamphlets. There's several layers of kind of mental energy that have to go into photographing a movement as an activist, especially when you have been made aware of the impact that your actions as a photographer could have on the movement, either extremely good or extremely bad. Which is why I'm gonna help make you aware of some of those impacts in this video, so strap in. Photographing a demonstration will never be as hard as it's gonna be after watching and considering all of the things in this video. So what is the role of a photographer in activism? I would argue that if you are distributing your photos in the right way, if you're donating your photos to the movement, if they're getting distributed on social media, if they're being seen, basically, if you're taking respectful photos and those photos are then being seen, that you have a very valuable role to the movement. You know, I heard a great quote, and I don't know where this is from, but it's that the artist's job is to make the movement irresistible. And you as a photographer have that power. So you are an artist and you are capturing the movement in a way that makes it look irresistible to those who may be inclined to join in. When you photograph details of a movement, emotional, intimate moments that occur in these demonstrations, you're showing the world that it's not just about the broken glass or the giant screaming crowds. You're showing the world that it's about these human connections and human emotions and desires. And you know, that's obviously super valuable. So everyone who participates in art builds, which is, you know, where you get together in a big group of activists and you all like make art to be shown, you know, protest signs, banners, things like that. So anyone who participates in art builds or wears costumes or paints beautiful banners and flags, all of that would only be seen by the people who are directly involved in the demonstration, the people who attend the demonstration and who are there on the day. It would only be seen by them if it weren't for photographers who are then documenting that moment and sharing it to a wider audience. So all of that effort, it's your job as a photographer to preserve it and to distribute it. And that is an incredibly important job. It can sometimes feel like you're being opportunistic, or at least for me, in the past, it's felt like I'm being opportunistic by photographing the movement, you know, these very vulnerable moments where people get up on stage and will recount extremely personal events and details into the microphone, and the emotion on their face, it feels like an intimate moment. But it's really important to remember that that person is up there giving something out, and they're giving it out so that it can be taken by the movement. So you as a photographer, it is your job to take that and to then pass it out to a wider audience. That's one of my first pieces of advice is get over your hang-ups, understand that the people who attend movements and stand up on stage are there to be seen, want their stories shown, and it's your job as a photographer to show those stories. The media will often show you the large. You know, they'll show us the crowds, the demonstrations, the aftermath, the broken windows, and your role as an activist is to show the intimate. So the signs, the arts, the costumes, the drum circles, the dancing. If it's a small action, there may be no media coverage at all. Like I've been to actions that just don't have any media coverage, and they've got, you know, 20 or 30 people who have dedicated a Saturday to showing up and making a scene, and absolutely no one has acknowledged that they're doing this. And so if you as a photographer are not there to document it, it goes unseen and forgotten. And honestly, that is like the worst waste of people power. So make sure that people power is not going to waste. Show up, document the movement. Your role is extremely powerful. Okay, that was my introduction to activist photography. The next section is preparation. So first off, how do you find out about upcoming actions? I get asked this all the time. And when I posted on Facebook asking like, oh, I'm looking for people who photograph protests to interview for this thing, people replied with like, oh, well, we don't really have protests in Vancouver. And like, that couldn't be further from the truth. I could literally attend an action every single weekend. Like, there are tons of protests for tons of different causes that occur in Vancouver. How do you find out about them? Well, you can follow local activist groups on social media. I find a bunch of them are really active on Instagram in their stories. So if there's an action or demonstration coming up, or maybe one currently taking place, and you see their little story light up, you can find out information by clicking that. So if you're active on Instagram, which I am, it can be really helpful to follow Instagram accounts. You can also check out the Reddit page for your city. So for my city, which is Vancouver, r/Vancouver has information about, oh, the Canby Bridge is being blocked by protesters. And then there's all these comments about how horrible it is. And, oh my God, you have to take the Granville Street Bridge. And so you can find out information about active demonstrations there, or if there's big ones planned, they will appear on the subreddit at least a couple days ahead of time. You can also read the posters on telephone poles and accept flyers and things that are handed out to you at SkyTrain stations. A lot of the times people will hand out little handbills letting you know about upcoming actions. It can be tempting to ignore them, but don't, especially if they're activists whose cause you're sympathetic to. It can really make their time worthwhile if they get to give out at least one of those flyers to someone who says thank you. Speaking from experience. And the last one is just head downtown on a weekend. I know, at least in my city, Vancouver, there is almost always something going on at the Vancouver Art Gallery. I have yet to go there on a weekend in the middle of the day and not see at least one protest of some kind. So if you are really not wanting to discriminate in what protest you photograph, you can just head down there and basically do like a cold call, see what you can get. Of all of those methods, I definitely find the Instagram, following the Instagram pages and checking their stories to be the most helpful and effective way of finding demonstrations like a month ahead of time and planning it, book it off work or something. Once you've found out about this demonstration, you've scheduled it in, you're ready to go, there's the logistics of like your physical being, because when you leave to go to an action, you don't know how long you're going to be there. So be prepared, basically. I know some XR actions, like, it'll start at 12 and it'll just go for as long as it can go until everybody gets arrested, right? And there's no way to predict if the cops are going to swoop in like an hour, or if they're going to swoop in like 6 hours, or if they're going to be camping overnight. Like, it's really unpredictable, and so coming prepared is a super important part of that. Luckily, a lot of organizers will provide things like hand sanitizer and food, snacks, refreshments. I've been to protests that had like a full vegan barbecue setup, which was not too shabby, like falafels and everything. Don't plan on that. Bring snacks, bring a power bar, a muffin, like a wrap. Something that'll keep for a long period of time that you can kind of snack on throughout the day. It's also a really good idea to know where the washrooms are going to be. There's not often porta potties at events like this, especially, spontaneous demonstrations. So just having like a mental map of where the public washrooms can be, just knowing where they are and being able to recall them in case you need it, like, definitely handy. You don't want to be bogged down by like a whole bunch of gear. If you know that it's only going to be like a 2-hour demonstration, there's probably going to be a lot of different kind of things that you need to do. Then bring 2 cameras for sure. But if it's going to be like an 8-hour demonstration and you're like going to be camping out on a bridge or something, it can really help to stay lightweight. You're not going to need a tripod. I've seen people bring tripods and like the long zoom lenses. I'm like, why? I mean, I guess I get it if you're trying to get a picture of like Greta Thunberg or somebody like way up on stage 100,000 people away, but like if you're just photographing your average demonstration, you don't need a tripod and it's just going to get in the way. If you have 2 camera bodies using 2 different lenses, obviously on those camera bodies is ideal. I would recommend having like a versatile longer lens, like my 24 to 70 millimeter lens is perfect on one, and then like a portrait lens for those closer intimate details on the other, so like a 50 or 55, something like that. I've taken a lot of protest photography with my 55 millimeter, and honestly, like, I just really love that kind of intimate look that it gives. It isolates the subject. It really makes you hone in on this one person in the crowd, blurs out everything in the background, like flattens distractions and things like that, and just helps the eye focus on what you are showing them. So yeah, definitely recommend that. I don't 100% recommend using prime lenses. I have used prime lenses at protests before. I've used my 55 millimeter, or my 50 millimeter. Is it 50 millimeter? I've used my 50 millimeter, but it is extremely difficult because, if somebody's, 6 feet away from you and you're taking a picture of them, that's great, that's really easy. But if somebody's way up on stage and you're trying to take a picture of them, then it gets extremely difficult. So it really kind of curtails the variety of images that you're able to get. Finally, especially if it's a march, you're gonna wanna dress athletically. You're gonna wanna wear running shoes. Don't wear pants with big bell bottoms. They're gonna flap around as you're running. I have made that mistake, and it's awful. Wear, tighter pants or shorts, something that's not going to get in your way as you're running, shoes that you can definitely run in. You know, you're going to want to carry a camera bag that you can kind of hitch up under your arm to, like, you know, tear around. I do a lot of running during those marches because you're always either wanting to be out in front or in the back or photographing the crowd in the middle. And the crowd is, you know, it's big, but the front seems to move very fast. I know that's probably not accurate, but it seems like they're just charging sometimes. And I'm like running as fast as I possibly can. Out to front, snap, snap, snap. Oh, they're too close. Okay, run again. Like, snap, snap, snap. Oh, they're too close. Run again. Like, it gets extremely athletic. And I, at the last protest, I met a very lovely person named Sam, and I, you know, did my photographer thing, like, hey, you're a photographer? I'm a photographer, like, cool, good, let's network. And they, you know, halfway between the thing, they came in to me like, I had no idea that this would involve so much running. I was like, I'm gonna put that in my video because I'm sure a lot of people don't expect that you will be running so much at a protest, but you will, so be prepared. Another really important element is to know the message that the demonstration is telling, is showing. In last week's interview with John Goldsmith, he mentioned that it is a good idea to get a series of images that tell the complete story rather than looking for like one image that tells it all, because that one image, while they do exist, is extremely rare and you don't want to be spending all of your time and energy looking for that perfect shot. It's way better to grab a series of images that can tell the story of the movement and the demonstration from the start to the finish. And in order to tell that story, you're going to need to know it. As a street photographer, oftentimes you get to kind of make up the story. You know, you see a person, you get to make up a little narrative and then take photos that kind of fit that narrative for the sake of the art. But it's different in protest photography because if you're then imposing a narrative onto a demonstration, that's a bit of an issue. So you want to find out what the story is that the movement and the demonstrators are looking to show, and then do your best to capture that story with as much fidelity as you can as an artist. You know, there's still a lot of room for artistic expression and interpretation, but overall, you're going to want to know the message that the demonstrators are trying to get out there, because it's your job as an activist photographer, like your role in the movement is to document that message. So in bad protest photography, it doesn't tell a story at all. It just shows. It shows the crowd or it shows the signs, but it doesn't really, and sometimes it's not even obvious what the protest is about in bad protest photography. You know, you can tell maybe it's a anti-racist movement or maybe it's an environmentalist movement, but that's it. And so you really want to hone in on the things that make that movement specific to that time, place, and to the message that they're sharing. You know, in last week's interview, Jason Little said that activists turned photographer have an advantage over photographers turned activist because they already understand the message that the movement is showing. And I think that's super true. If you come from within the movement and you pick up a camera, you know that movement, you know what that story is. You were part of writing that story maybe and curating that story. You have a huge advantage over a photographer who's just showing up with a camera with no idea what's going on. Another element of good preparation is to know the route. Now this is more of a physical concern. So know where the bathrooms are was something that I mentioned, but also know, you know, if it's a march, are they going around bends? Are there any like vantage points where you can get up high? Is there anything you can stand on? The climate marches that take place downtown often go underneath this overpass in Nordstrom, and you can enter the overpass through Pacific Center Mall. So there's been some protests where I've like, you know, torn over around the corner and like run as fast as I can up this escalator and then over and then just like camped out in the Nordstrom overpass to get like the perfect overhead shot of the crowd as they come underneath. Again, running. But yeah, knowing like where you can get up high is a really important part of knowing the route. If there's statues you can climb to like get a better shot. And then also just being like cognizant as you're there of high points and places that you can get those aerial shots, because yeah, they're going to be really important for showing, you know, the gravity of the situation, for showing the bulk of the movement. You can even go so far as to know where the sun's going to be and so how the shadows are going to land. I know that I've been to enough protests at the Vancouver Art Gallery that I know exactly where the sun hits the buildings and then casts these beautiful rays of light. And so I can then plan for that and stand in those places waiting for people to come through. So that's me knowing the route to an uncomfortable degree, but that's just because I live in a small city and all protests are basically held in the same spot. Okay, this one, I wasn't so sure which section to put this in, so I'm putting it in preparation, but it's gonna fit into some other sections too. But it's important to keep in mind is that it's good practice to ask for consent if you're photographing people's faces, especially the faces of vulnerable populations in arrestable situations. So the FBI, and I know that I'm in Canada, so the FBI doesn't apply, but I'm sure Canadian FBI, CSIS, whatever, can do the same thing. The FBI is able to identify protesters from photos that are posted online, and those photos have been used in the past to incriminate protesters, especially during the Black Lives Matter movement. So it's really not a good idea to photograph people participating in events maybe where things have gotten out of hand, or if law enforcement has any reason to dislike the protesters of that movement, maybe don't photograph their faces. And with that in mind, obviously COVID has made demonstrating difficult for other reasons, but it has made photographing protests a little bit easier because everybody's wearing a mask, and so everybody's faces are naturally covered. And so it's easier to avoid getting people's faces without consent. But you got to keep it in mind, if you're getting used to photographing movements during COVID, you're going to have to relearn how to photograph movements after COVID when people's faces are not covered. So yeah, avoid faces. That said, you totally can just point at your camera and get consent. And oftentimes the photographs that you ask for turn out nicer than the ones that you kind of take anyways, because the people are more enthusiastic, they're holding up the sign, they're more posed, and they're just an equal participant in the image, which for protest photography especially, I think can be a really nice contribution to the movement, to have these happy, smiling, enthusiastic faces peering out from the photographs, rather than people who are caught in an awkward moment or something. Plus, if people in the movement don't know who you are, but you're being respectful and you're asking to take photos and you're interacting with them before you're just snapping pictures, they're more likely, in my experience, to be friendly towards you in the future and to be, accepting of you as a member of the movement. Whereas if you just come in and you never say anything to anyone and you're just snapping photos, then you can I easily be mistaken as a member of the press or somebody who's just being opportunistic and grabbing photos of a movement for their own personal gain. It really helps to endear you to the movement when you treat your subjects as people, as co-participants, rather than just as subjects behind the lens. Final thing on this is that even if their faces are covered, if you're in a position where you're actively arrestable, so you're occupying a bridge or something and the police have read an injunction and they are now going to start arresting people, it's a really good idea to not photograph people, especially if they're easily identifiable by things other than just the bottom half of their face, which may be covered by a mask. For example, if they have bright blue hair or a distinctive style of dress or really anything, I really honestly would recommend not taking pictures of people after an injunction has been read or in particularly arrestable situations, just in case. Especially not people in communities that are particularly vulnerable to police violence. So, all of that is almost like a disclaimer to this last part of preparation, which is know your rights. So there are certain circumstances where you may feel compelled to photograph people without their consent, where it may be an important part of documenting what's going on. So, for example, if a white supremacist shows up and starts pushing people around, trying to start a conflict, it is important to document that, because oftentimes violence breaks out at these protests because somebody will show up with the explicit intention of causing violence, of provoking violence, and then they'll turn around and say, look, this group of people is violent, when the protest was, by and large, extremely peaceful until that person showed up. So you want to be able to document that person. And you do have a legal right to photograph anyone in Canada who is in a public space. So if their face is uncovered and you take a picture of them and they're standing on public property, they can't then come up to you and be like, delete that, it's illegal, I didn't consent to that photo. You are technically allowed to have that image of them if they are in a public place, as long as they're not a minor. That said, you can't photograph anyone in a place or time when they could reasonably expect privacy. So if they're in the bathroom or a change room or they're home, you can't do that. I don't even know if you can photograph them through their car window. I've got links to some interesting articles about photography law in Canada down below. And you also really need to be aware of private versus public property. So I've done a die-in at a mall, which is where everybody lies down on the ground in a mall. Now that's private property. Technically it's not a public space, even though it's open to the public. And so if you were to photograph, a security guard acting antagonistically towards the demonstrators in that situation, that might be a legal issue for you if that security guard then challenges you on it. On the flip side, there have been several cases, in the States especially, but in Canada also, of journalists and press and other photographers being harassed by the police while documenting protests and movements in completely legal ways. Police often get confused about these laws and try to confiscate your camera or arrest you even for taking pictures. After the protests down in the States following the murder of George Floyd, there were several different documented incidents of police grabbing cameras out of reporters' hands, press photographers getting hit by rubber bullets, like all of these things that are extremely illegal actions on behalf of the police against photojournalists, people with cameras, essentially. So, knowing your rights, you could sue if you get your camera confiscated. If you're not legally under arrest, the police are not allowed to confiscate property from you. So if they take your camera, but they don't arrest you and they don't charge you with anything, that's illegal. You can sue, you can get your camera back, which is why it is so important to know your rights. Because if you're the victim of this kind of police aggression, police violence, follow through with it. Hold their ass to the fire, in my opinion. They should know the law before they go trying to enforce it. And unfortunately, even if you're not actually breaking the law, you can't always expect police to know that. Because they may enforce the law, but bizarrely, that doesn't mean that they've cared to learn it or to remember it. Do your due diligence, know your rights as a photographer, and be ready to defend them and stand up for them if necessary. Okay, section number 3. So section number 3 is how to photograph a movement respectfully. So I already talked about, being respectful and asking for consent, not photographing people who haven't given their consent or people's faces when they're in arrestable situations, things like that. That all definitely gets folded into the ethics of protest photography and how to do it respectfully. Another element of how to photograph protest photography is the bit that I mentioned about telling the story, knowing the message, telling it with fidelity or as much fidelity as you can. That's all very important and integral to photographing movements in a respectful way. There's a few more things that I wanted to mention though. So first off is don't interfere with the action and, stay out of the way. And the more you get in the way as a photographer, the more you impact the images that you're taking. So people will start to give you dirty looks if you're being, rude or obtrusive. And this will create a misleading interpretation, a misleading storyline in your images. If everybody in the crowd is looking at you all angry, then your images will appear to be of an angry crowd, when really you're just being an asshole, getting in everybody's way. That's why they're looking at you angrily. But you've now created misleading images documenting that space and time. And that's kind of the opposite of what your intention should be when you're photographing a movement. So making sure that you are not standing in front of anybody, so be respectful. I'm always looking around behind me. When I'm up front, like close to the speaker, I'm squatted down like as low as I can possibly go. I don't want to be in anyone's way, right? The demonstrators are more important than you, especially if you are not like attending meetings, you're not like an active participant in this movement other than showing up to help donate your time and labor to photograph the movement. They're the ones propelling the movement, and you are just documenting their work, right? And you're doing good work in documenting their work, but they've still put this work in, and you really need to respect that doing the work is a pretty important part, and when you're getting in the way of it to document it, there's just some irony there, but just don't do it. So I have actually seen photographers stand directly in front of Indigenous elders sitting in wheelchairs. So, up on the podium, everybody's cheering and everything. And then there's like this section of people in wheelchairs in the front. And then in front of them, there's the section of like photographers snapping pictures. I don't understand how you can be that blind to your own impact on the situation. You're robbing somebody else of the chance to experience this movement because you're documenting it in such an inconsiderate way. That's a problem. I've also seen, and this one was like, I almost said something to the guy and I still kick myself that I didn't, but at a Black Lives Matter protest in like June of 2020, this white male photographer grabs a black female protester and like physically pulls her out of the way so that he can get a picture of the size of the crowd. Like without even talking to her, he just like grabs her by the shoulder and like rips her out of the way, like so he can start photographing. And I was just like, holy dude, like how do you not see what you just did? Like, so don't do that. Don't interfere with the crowd. Don't interfere with the discourse or with what's going on just for the sake of documenting it. That's literally the opposite of what you're supposed to be doing. You're trying to document this movement with fidelity, with honesty, and that's not going to happen if you're up there grabbing protesters out of the way to free up your composition or something. Like, it makes me so mad just thinking about it. Another piece of that is to communicate with the people around you. And I mentioned this a bit earlier, but when you are in active communication with the other participants in the demonstration, that informs them that you are wise to the cause, that you are actively participating in the cause. You're not just there to be like an outside observer. It lets them know that you are also an activist, basically. But it also like helps humanize your subjects to you. So you've interacted with these people, you know who they are, maybe you know a little bit more about their story or why they're there. That can be super important for telling an honest story and photographing them in an honest way, right? So it's really good to communicate, get to know the people around you, do a little bit of networking, find out why they're there, what their story is. There's lots of opportunity at these protests and demonstrations to chat with people, and I highly recommend doing that. The next piece I have is kind of follows from that. It's don't be opportunistic to a fault. So photographers, I've seen them get up on stage with speakers and take photos facing the crowd. So you're literally behind the speakers and the entire crowd can see you there. You're just ruining the visual experience. Like, these protests and demonstrations are highly visual movements, right? Like, they're there to be seen, to get eyes on the issue that they're rallying about. And when you're there disrupting the visual impact that these highly visual events has, you're having a pretty big impact, even if you're doing something as small as just sneaking around behind the speaker taking pictures. So you really, really need to be cognizant of that when you're getting up on stage to take photos of speakers. That said, sometimes there are good opportunities to do that, and there's a really good reason. And if you have like the perfect shot and you're like, this is really going to help the movement, I think this is going to be an amazing shot, it's going to inspire people, then do it, but do it quickly and do it respectfully, and then get out of there. Don't just stand there snapping a billion pictures, because you are actively contaminating the scene with your presence. One of the starkest examples of this that I have seen recently was an occupation at Smith and Nelson, and it was a die-in, and so everybody dies. They lie down and act like they're dead in the street, and it makes a message about what is basically going to happen to us if we're not acting on climate change. It's a very visual and very impactful message, and the impact of the message comes from the way it looks, right? So it's visually focused and visually centered. And so at this demonstration, you know, they did the die-in, and I was trying to get a good picture from the sidelines of the die-in, and so I went up, and it was like hard, like there was crowd people around, people who weren't lying down and stuff. So I went up this flight of stairs onto like this landing to like look down at it, and that's when I realized that all of the people who were standing up were photographers. So the impact of the movement was diluted by the fact that there was all of these people in there standing up, snapping pictures, taking the opportunity to like snap close-ups of people acting like they're dead. Like, and these people have really long lenses. Like, I can't speak for all of them, but I know that at least some of those long lenses could zoom in. Like, you could be on the sidelines taking that same photo. I think something kind of like takes over for photographers, especially if they're not being cognizant of all the stuff that I'm talking about in this video. Like, if you're just there to get that one shot, then you can maybe almost be possessed by that drive to get that one shot and like sacrifice a lot of other considerations in order to get that one shot. And just seeing so many photographers doing that all at once and actively ruining the way that this demonstration looks because of that like need to get the shot, it made me feel pretty upset. And, you know, I'm sure I've been guilty of that in the past, and maybe that's why it made me feel so upset, is because it's like, I figured out that I was doing this and I stopped, so why can't you, right? Like, that was a frustrating moment. I would definitely recommend that you take stock of what the movement looks like, what it's supposed to look like, what message it's sending by looking like that, and then strive to photograph it in a way that is telling that story, that intended story, and that isn't interfering with that intended story. Also, just like the fact that they were in there getting close-ups of people's faces, like, I already talked about why that's kind of rude, and you're doing it at a moment when they're pretending to be dead, so they literally can't like move or like get out of the way without interrupting the movement themselves. So it's like, oh, haha, you're pretending to be dead, so now I can photograph you. I don't know, I could say a lot about this, but I mean, I have already, but I'll move on. Okay, so my last part of this section is get involved and photograph the movement from within the movement. So a lot of the issues that I've talked about in this section are issues that are common among people who are not involved in the movement and are still trying to come in and photograph it. So getting involved in the movement is the best way to understand what the movement's about and to really capture the story of the movement, because you know the story, right? I mean, you can do your research and learn what the story is, but attending meetings and, you know, talking to organizers and just knowing the people in the movement is honestly the best way to understand what you're there for, what you're there to capture. So to do that, getting involved, you can reach out to the Instagram accounts of local activist groups. So I already said to follow them, so you know who they are. For some reason, I find they do tend to be more responsive on Instagram than through email. Maybe because, I mean, I've run activist email accounts and I get like 1 email a month. So it's like, you know, you got one person checking it like once a month because that's pretty much all that needs to be done. Whereas on Instagram, you know, they're constantly posting, so they're checking it anyways, even if they don't expect to have correspondence there. So ask for information on how to get involved from them. They'll often point you to somebody, they'll give you an email of somebody who's more active or something like that. The meetings are almost all online right now during COVID, so it's really low barrier to participation. You just sign into Zoom, it's usually like an hour and a half. And you do get to meet people. I mean, especially in the smaller groups. There's one group that I'm a part of that has like 6 or 7 members that show up, and it's nice. Like, it's intimate. You get to know who they are, and you get to have buddies to go to the next rallies with. You can also approach organizers at demonstrations and ask to be put on email lists. So oftentimes they'll have like a sign-up sheet, like a clipboard, and you just put down your name and email, and then you'll be on the email list. They could also loop you into chat apps like Signal or Telegram are used a lot by activists for coordinating. So if they have reason to trust you, that you're not like a Fed, then you could maybe get involved with one of these apps. The next is to attend meetings and then offer your services up as a photographer. Like, make it really blatant. Like, hey, I am a photographer, but I'm not just a photographer, I'm also an activist, and I'm here to help. So, you know, ask to get like a set list even of just, you know, pictures that they want to capture. I've made that mistake before where I didn't ask, like, you know, I go there explicitly intending to photograph this movement. I've been asked by the people at the movement to get some pictures to send, and I didn't ask, what would you like pictures of? And so it turned out that they wanted a bunch of pictures of the people getting arrested, and that was something that I intentionally avoided photographing. And if I had asked, I would have known, and so I would have been able to better capture that movement in the way that would be directly helpful to the movement, and I failed there. So I'm going to keep that in mind for the future. So yeah, ask for a set list, find out what kinds of images will be most helpful to the movement, and then like dedicate yourself to capturing those images. And yeah, like all of this, getting involved is, you know, you're helping the movement in more ways than just being a photographer, which is super important. And you're also understanding the work that goes into these movements. Like, you're getting kind of a behind the scene look at how much human power actually goes into putting a demonstration or something on, making it happen. And you're gonna have that reverence and respect for that time and energy be reflected in the photos that you capture if you're aware of it. So there's a lot of good reasons to get involved, so please do. Okay, so my next section. Now, I've been filming for 2 hours already, and I still have so much more to talk about. But okay, so my next section is how to get a good shot. So composition is still important, even in chaotic situations. And I know that I have already given you a lot to think about in terms of how to photograph. And none of that stuff has actually like helped to inform what your photograph is going to look like at the end. You're still thinking about composition, right? Like, sorry, I'm laughing because I do find it really funny that I've talked for like 2 hours about how to photograph a protest, and I'm only just now getting to composition. And this is kind of where I think coming from a street photography background can really lend itself to protest photography. If you're not an activist, you can just skip all of the previous steps and go straight to this one. So with street photography, there's a lot of like waiting around, finding a good spot, finding a good composition, deciding what element would help to cinch that composition together, and then just waiting for that element to walk into the frame. And you're still doing that as a street photographer while balancing all of your other kind of ethical and activist-related obligations. Street photography is about finding good composition and interesting subject matter in the uncontrolled, spontaneous environment of the public street, right? Activist photography, protest photography is like street photography times 100 as far as getting good photos goes. You need to be maintaining constant vigilance of every single thing that's happening around you, but also an awareness of how those things fit together visually. So there's 2 really distinct parts of your brain that need to be activated when you're doing this. The part of your brain that like processes what you're looking at and its emotional importance, and the part of your brain that just like is completely removed from emotional importance and is only seeing like lines and colors and shapes. And having both of those activated at the same time is mentally exhausting. It is, but it can produce some really amazing results. And when you get home from a protest photography session, the feeling of reward that you can get after you do your absolute best to get the best photographs possible, best in both a composition photography sense and in an activist demonstration sense, like that feeling is very rewarding. So bear with me here. My best advice to you is to focus on your task, on your message, and on your craft. So avoid taking shots of nothing in particular. It can be tempting to take pictures of large faceless crowds or just a ton of signs, but honestly, like a photo of a single readable sign with an important, impactful message on it is way more impactful of a photo than a photo of 100 illegible signs all bobbing around in the distance. A photo of a protester looking at the camera, maybe holding up a sign, they've got some kind of art piece in their hair or something, that is a way more impactful image than a photo of 1,000 of them in a crowd that they just turn into like a colorful blur, right? So you're still thinking about how you can isolate your subject in the frame, what subjects you're going to isolate in the frame, considering what's going to tell the story of that protest, what is best to isolate in the frame, and what competing elements are going on in the background. So I find that sunny days, like vibrant, bright sunny days, are the best. And that's maybe a controversial opinion for photographers, but I really like the way that you can use harsh shadows to isolate your subject. So if you've got, a march going along, and then you've got like one beam of light coming down, it can be easy to capture the march and all the signs in the background, but also isolate the subject that you're wanting to focus on. So using shadows, buildings, and lines to frame your subject. I find that shadows, if they're not too harsh, but they're still there, they can drown everything else out without getting rid of it completely, without taking it out of the shot. And so I find, that really harsh shadows are a great way of isolating a subject and maintaining the fidelity of the context that they're in. At events like rallies that are going on for like 2 hours or something, I know I'm going to have some time to get some good shots. I've already gotten whatever shots were on my list of shots that I wanted to get. I will just find a cool spot that has, lights coming down, like maybe, at the Vancouver Art Gallery, for example, there's a spot where the light hits a building and then cascades down, and it's just really nice lighting on people's faces. You can kind of have the person positioned in front of the reflection of the sun, and so they're backlit, but then also being hit by the real sun so that they have this dual lighting. So I like that spot, and I will camp out in that spot until the sun changes position, that it's no longer there, and just wait for interesting things to walk through the frame. I got this photo of this woman with this beautiful outfit. I don't know what I would call it, like wings. This is an environmentalist protest, so she's got the earth and the water kind of aesthetic. I love that shot. But yeah, I just waited there because, I jumped around, got everything I wanted, and then was just like, this spot's beautiful, and every photo that I'm going to get here is going to be beautiful, so I'm just going to wait. And also, going back to John Goldsmith's advice, taking multiple photos that tell the whole story rather than just waiting around for the Holy Grail photo is a super good approach, because oftentimes, these photos aren't going to be displayed just one photo of the event. It's going to be a photo reel or a photo set. Instagram has that carousel feature, so you can have up to 10 photos per post. Oftentimes, activist groups will take advantage of that. So, there isn't really any pressure to get everything in one photo. Just make sure that the general composition, you're isolating subjects that tell every part of that story, and looking at them all together, you can read the complete story. So I talked a little bit about having a list of photos that you want to get, and I think last week's video, John Goldsmith also talked about that list of photos. And so in order to prepare for that list, I actually found a really interesting resource in this Tony and Chelsea video, which I've linked below, and they have an acronym for photographing demonstrations, and that acronym is M.E.A.L.S. Now, I'm also going to add police, so M.E.A.L.S plus police is going to be your basic set. But so their M.E.A.L.S stands for marching, emotion, attendance, leaders, and signs. So marching, you're going to want to know the route, which we talked about, and capture the march. Maybe there's a bend in the road where you can get the entire march kind of coming along, you can see at the sides, the back. Maybe there's the road dips down, and so you can come back up on this side and get the protest going all the way up the street. Something like that. You want to be able to capture the breadth of the movement, the number of people who are participating. The next one is the emotion. So know the story. You want to capture the emotional depth. If it's a very intense protest, you maybe don't want to be capturing pictures of people in spontaneous fits of laughter or something. It doesn't fit the tone. It's not appropriate. No shame to the people who are laughing, but as an element that's telling the story of that protest, it doesn't really fit in with the overall message. But knowing the emotional story of the protest and doing your best to capture that emotional story honestly, isolating elements that do a good job of telling that story, and maybe disqualifying elements that don't. Attendance, so yeah, show the crowd, show how big it is, show what kind of people are participating in it. And then we got L for leaders, which is the people with megaphones, the organizers. You want to give them the credit they deserve, right? Oftentimes, like I said, organizing these events takes huge amounts of human power to get these events off the ground, to get them to happen. And these leaders deserve the credit. They're up on stage with a megaphone because they want to be seen, they want to be heard, and it is your job as a photographer to oblige, to take photos of them, to make sure that they are included in the story of that movement, that they helped to create, that they played an integral role in creating. And then finally is signs. So Tony and Chelsea in their video recommend photographing high contrast signs with bold lettering. I super agree because yeah, they stand out even in a black and white photo. Like, you know, in last week's interviews, Jason Little was talking about the utility of photographing movements in black and white and how it helps to kind of reduce background noise and distractions. And I completely agree. And I find that in black and white, bold lettering stands out regardless of what color it originally is for obvious reasons. Signs oftentimes are meant to be photographed. People make them because they want them to be seen. So do them that service, photograph them. Finally, my addition to this M.E.A.L.S acronym is the police aspect, but M.E.A.L.S doesn't sound as good, so we're saying M.E.A.L.S plus police. But photograph the police. Like, you're allowed to photograph police. They may not believe that you're allowed to because they don't know the law for some reason, but you are allowed to, and if they're in a public place. So are they wearing masks? Are they interacting with large groups without masks on? Are they over-prepared for a violent conflict? Do they look like they're ready to go? Are they abusing demonstrators? Are they pushing people around? Are they actively violating protesters' constitutional rights? For example, by confiscating cameras. All of these things are things that you're going to want to document. And so, you know, knowing where the police are and just having it in the back of your mind, like to monitor what they're doing so that you're ready to snap a shot as soon as they start acting out of line, super important. And, you know, the conduct of the police very much impact the conduct of the protesters. If the protesters are actively being tear gassed or being pushed around, then yeah, they're going to be a little bit more hostile to the police than they would be if the police were leaving them alone. And I've been in situations where the protesters are completely fine and then the police come in and just start pushing us all aside, rounding us all up, and it's like, what am I even doing? Like, I'm literally just standing on a sidewalk with a camera. Why are you pushing me? And police interactions with the environmentalist movement in Vancouver have been incredibly tame compared to police interactions with the Black Lives Matter movement down in the States. I mean, I'm pretty sure everybody watching this has seen how violently, how brutally the police behave towards these protesters who, ironically, are protesting police brutality. We never, like here in Canada at least, I never would have found out about that if it weren't for the people documenting that through photography and videography. Like, that's why your role as a photographer in the movement is so important, is because you are showing that kind of thing to people, and if nobody ever thought to photograph the police or to document their actions at a protest, we wouldn't know. Another great example of that is the pictures that we saw of how the police behaved during the January 6th Capitol riot, and they, you know, were barely wearing armor in some cases, were interacting with the protesters, taking selfies with the protesters. Like, not all of the Capitol Police were, but ones that weren't were being actively vilified and hunted down by the protesters. The police response to right-wing violence and the way it contrasts against the police response to the left-wing exercising of democratic rights is a really important contrast that we should be able to see. And we can only see that if people take the time to photograph police and their behavior at these movements. Final bit on this. I recently took, and this is kind of why this is on my mind specifically right now, is last weekend I took several photos of police officers at an anti-mask protest. Now, first of all, here are how many police officers showed up to the last environmentalist protest I was at. It's literally like an army. Like, there's like probably 50 people there. And then here's the police officer who showed up to the anti-mask protest, which is, I would argue, a by far more dangerous group. Like, the people in the anti-mask movement are ready for violence. They want like a civil war. They're nuts. But only 5 police officers showed up, and none of the police officers were wearing masks at an anti-mask movement. I have pictures of police officers just chatting with anti-maskers. Neither of them are wearing masks. I'm not surprised, but like, come on, you're supposed to pretend you're not with the fascists. You didn't think I was gonna get this political when you watched my first filter review video, did ya? Okay, so that brings me to my last section of this video. Thank you guys so much for making it this far. The dangers and cautions. So the first danger or caution that I have for you is the temptation to overextend or over-participate. And what I mean by that, I personally often feel compelled to over-engage with the action, and sometimes it can be to my own detriment. So, for example, if you are at an action where people are getting arrested, people are willingly giving themselves up for arrest, which is very common at Extinction Rebellion events, it can feel easy to get caught up with the crowd and want to also put yourself in that arrestable position. But it's important to consider that you have a camera full of images of people's faces that you haven't sorted through yet, right? And the police, once you're arrested, can legally confiscate that camera and all of the images on it. It's possible that you'll never get those images back, so all of the time that you've donated to the movement up until then will have been wasted. And it's possible that those images could be used to incriminate other people who are participating in the movement. So you're either not doing anything good for the movement, or you're actively harming the movement if you're over participating like this. Even though it may have seemed at that time that putting yourself in an arrestable position, standing up for the movement in that way, was a good choice. Another example is shouting at cops who are arresting or antagonizing demonstrators. You might once have been able to get a clear shot of cops discussing tactics or interacting with each other because they just see you as press. But as soon as you start shouting at them and antagonizing them, or even just joining in with a chorus of demonstrators, then they know that you're with the demonstrators and they'll start seeing you more as the enemy or as the problem. And that is going to color the kinds of images that you're able to capture of them. You know, maybe you were able to stand up on this post box and get an aerial photo before, but now the cops are saying, hey, get down off that post box, because you've identified yourself as a hostile force to them and they're reacting in kind. So now you're not able to get photos of cops interacting with each other. You're not able to get photos from overhead positions. It's really going to impact the kind of images that you're able to collect. And that is going to impact your ability to contribute to the movement as a photographer, all because you felt inclined to over participate. And so I know I just went on like an anti-cop rant a little bit, but after having said that, you do want to avoid doing anything to antagonize the cops or put yourself as a photographer at risk of being arrested, because your role in the movement is to document it, and you need to stick to that role. If you're changing roles mid-movement, then you're going to compromise your ability to participate in a meaningful way. You can't take pictures of police arresting nonviolent protesters if you yourself are in handcuffs. So know your role, commit to your role, give yourself positive self-talk saying my role is important even if I'm not being arrested, even if I'm not shouting or screaming. My role is important, and just keep that in mind, stick to it, and you can do it well. So my final piece on the dangers, we've talked a lot about police brutality. It is very real in these movements, especially if you are participating in a movement like the Black Lives Matter movement that is explicitly calling out police brutality, and as a result of that seems to be a magnet for police brutality. So, be very aware of your surroundings when you're in a movement that has any potential for violence. The police will be violent without warning, and you don't want to put yourself or your equipment in any kind of danger. Aside from police, counter-protesters can also escalate a situation. I mentioned, the scenario of a white supremacist showing up and knocking people around, trying to start something violent so that they can call the entire movement violent. So, there could be white supremacist groups, neo-Nazi groups, alt-right, pro-oil groups, pro-gun enthusiasts. There's like all kinds of crazies who do show up to these protests as counter-protesters, and their specific intention is to bait activists into confrontations. And so being aware of these people and being aware of your role is to document these people and not to engage with them, because they oftentimes are not all there. Like somebody who dresses up like Hitler and shows up to an anti-racist rally probably isn't super well in the head, and that's not the kind of person that you really want to be in direct confrontation with, especially when you're wearing something expensive around your neck. It's not your job to get involved in these confrontations, it's your job to document the confrontations. If you see a bold activist getting up in the face of a neo-Nazi, that's your job, is to document that. It's not to be the person getting up in their face. It's your job to photograph that and to share that image and show how brave the people in your movement are in the face of, blatant hate. Masquerading as a neutral observer in these situations can feel really gross because obviously, for obvious reasons, right? But it can be an important thing to do when your job is documenting the movement, unless things are getting seriously out of hand and somebody does need to step in. But if you're, actively shouting and antagonizing the people who have shown up to counter-protest, then that will prevent you from getting pictures of them maybe when their guard is down. And those pictures can be really important for telling the story of who they are and why they would show up, There's times when it's really good to not be a neutral observer. For example, if somebody's getting hurt or actively, having aggressive behavior thrust upon them and there's nobody around, like, yeah, step in for sure. Like, photography can be a secondary thing at that point. But if there's like a big crowd of protesters and like one counter protester, then your job isn't to join this big crowd. Your job is to document that interaction. So I guess like part of the consideration that is in this danger is knowing when to walk that line of remaining neutral and photographing it from a neutral perspective and dropping that air of neutrality and jumping in. And that's, you know, something that you're going to need to determine in a case-by-case basis. But it's always good to act when you see people getting hurt. So keep that in mind, please. The next thing to consider is that when you're photographing hostile crowds, so for example, the anti-mask movement is extremely hostile to being photographed. There's been times that I've felt like actively unsafe around them, not just because I'm worried that I'm gonna get COVID, but because they're actually like looking at me like they're gonna come and grab my camera or something like that. It helps to carry mace, and I do. I have a little thing of mace that I keep in my pocket, so I've got, you know, one hand holding the camera and the other hand on the mace, and I'm ready, you know, like, because you don't know if somebody's gonna come and grab your camera. It can be really good to just whip that out and be like, don't. Like, I don't recommend photographing these movements unless you really, really feel compelled to. I mean, I personally do, because I just have like this kind of hateful obsession with like what kind of people even are anti-maskers. Like, who are they, right? It's just such a bizarre anti-logical movement that I'm in a way a little bit fascinated with, like, not with the individuals, but just with the ideology that can draw people together from all of these bizarre walks of life and unify them all behind one message that doesn't make any sense. Like, I don't know. So I do photograph anti-mask movements as much as I can, obviously staying as far away as I can, but there are definitely times that I feel like I am in danger because they see me as a member of the press, or they just see that I'm wearing a mask and that makes them hate me. Like, and you can see that hatred in their eyes, and it can be really disturbing looking at like 50 people who are all looking back at you like they literally want to kill you. Definitely wearing multiple masks to an event like this can help, because they will get close to you and like pretend to cough on you and like do all kinds of crazy shit to antagonize you. I've had people like brush up against me and like at me, like, dude, like, personal space still applies. You know, even if you're rejecting COVID, I still have personal space you gotta respect. But they just have like absolutely no concept of that. So if you're photographing movements like that or that hostile, just be super aware. There's all gas, no brakes, and he does, or, you know, there was a whole controversy, so I don't think it's him anymore, but like, when he was creating content, he did a really, really good job of showing what it looks like on the inside of a movement. And there was a few times that he was in like a white supremacist crowd interviewing these people, and then they'd be all like, no, we're not violent, we're not violent. And then he'd go and interview like photographers of color who had been like kicked in the head and like their cameras had been stolen and like all this shit, and like they had very clearly had acts of violence perpetrated against them, despite the fact that the crowd is so insistent that there's no violence going on. So, you know, if you are a member of a targeted population, that could be a person of color, that could even just be somebody who's wearing a mask. Like, if you're a member of a population who these people hate, just be extremely aware. Be super careful, carry mace. You know, the police aren't gonna do a lot to help you, unfortunately, but know where the police are, because at least they're gonna prevent outright violence, hopefully, maybe. Know where your exits are. Just, yeah, come prepared. All right, well, that was the video. I hope you guys enjoyed. I have been talking for 3 hours now. I have been in the process of filming and stuff for like 3.5 hours. I started putting my makeup on at 2:15 and it is now 6 o'clock. So I am really happy that I have finally filmed this video. It's definitely been a long time coming, and I hope that you guys enjoyed it. I hope that it was informative. I really feel like I said everything that I wanted to say. I know I covered a lot of topics, but honestly, it is a much bigger topic than you would think. And now that I've talked about it, hopefully you have an appreciation for why. If you enjoyed this video and you want to see more like longer form videos that cover topics really in depth, please let me know down in the comments. You can leave me a like. Seriously, if you like this video, like, I put 10 hours into this, and if you put like 10 seconds into liking it, like, that seems like a fair trade to me, honestly. Like, please just do. And if you like this video and you want to see more like it, in addition to leaving a comment and a like, you can also subscribe to my channel. I put out new videos every single Monday. I know my next few videos are going to be a bit fluffy because this one took a lot out of me. So I'll be back next week with probably like a filter review or something. Excellent. Well, thank you guys so much for watching. Take care, stay sharp, stay safe, and don't forget to keep shooting. You know, do your due diligence. Do your due diligence. That was very hard to say. Do your due diligence